for coming to give evidence to us. We're very grateful to you for doing that. It's an inquiry we're conducting into what the potential implications of BrExit would be for Erasmus and also for Horizon. So this is clearly the Erasmus part of that. I mean, clearly there is a degree of uncertainty about what will happen next, but I think that we have concluded the only thing to do is to press ahead with a slightly longer term view than you see bothering the press at the moment. So we're grateful to you for that. This session is a public session, as you know. It is being broadcast and will be transcribed, and at the end of, or after the session is ended, I will send you, or we will send you, a transcript of your evidence so that you can look and make certain that that does reflect what you actually said. So would you like, first of all, if I could ask just to introduce yourselves and your organisation so we're absolutely clear in our minds who you all are? Would you like to?
Sure, so Amate Doku, I'm Vice President Higher Education at the National Union of Students.
Thank you.
I'm John Latham, I'm Lancaster and Morecambe College. I'm representing the Association of Colleges today.
Thank you.
And I'm Gail Armstead, Associate Director of the Office of Global Engagement at the University of Nottingham and also representing the Russell Group today.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Well, I think that just about covers the beneficiaries of Erasmus, if I can put it that way. I wondered if you could just say what impact the current Erasmus programme, or Erasmus Plus programme, I suppose we should call it, what impact that has had in the UK in terms of enhancing operations for cooperation and for mobility. And if you could say at the same time how it has helped to increase opportunities and improve upwards mobility for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, which I know is one of the issues which concerns you. Who'd like to go first on that?
So, first of all,
Mr. Doku, thank you. Yes.
I'd just like to thank you for inviting us here today to speak about this issue. I am one of the lead officers on BrExit, and when it has come to the sort of the substantive issues, when you take the sort of broader politics out of the actual substantive issues for our students that they care about, this comes to the top of the list. So I'm really pleased that we have a chance to talk about this today. It was in whatever outcome we get, we were very, very clear from the outset that keeping as much the same and actually expanding Erasmus and the Erasmus Plus scheme was absolutely key, and it's something that our members and students tell us is hugely beneficial. We know that over the last 30 years of the Erasmus Plus programme alone, we've had over 300,000 students from the UK who've benefited from it, from a period of study or work abroad. That's about 15,000 in 2014-15 alone. And they're hugely, when you speak to students who've been on the programme and students who are also studying here as part of the programme, they're hugely beneficial opportunities for students to learn more about other countries, to learn more about other cultures, to learn more about other people, and it's seen as hugely valuable to them. It's not also just about what happens sort of in the classroom, as it were. You have cultural events, you have targeted outreach programs in schools, you've got community groups, you've got interactions with local residents as well, and these programs really contribute to a great understanding of each other, of different nations, of different cultures, of different traditions and different perspectives. And my understanding is that University of Scotland has done some research which has shown the social and cultural benefits of a diverse international learning environment, and that's absolutely something that we want to improve. And I may touch on some other things later, but there's a really important element as well around employability. You mentioned social mobility as well. We know that black and minority ethnic students, for example, on these programs are 41% less likely to be unemployed than non-exchange programs, and that mobile students from disadvantaged backgrounds also earn 6.1% more. So there are huge benefits to students not only going on those programs to understand more, but it really benefits them when they leave university and go into the jobs market.
Well, thank you very much for that. You mentioned one piece of evidence from the Scottish universities, I think, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll need to make... do we know about that? Yeah, that's good. Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Latham, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think, Lord Chairman, I'm coming from a different angle, and that's the vocational college angle. Yeah. It's still an integral part of Erasmus Plus, and the fact that the Erasmus Plus has a big focus on mobility isn't a coincidence. It's open to anybody and everybody, regardless of their social status or economic situation. And the actual mobility programme contributes to their general upward social mobility. It prepares people. It prepares people for higher education, prepares people to leave home for the first time. It's often the first time that people have been on an aeroplane out of the country, sometimes to the next big city. The change in young people is quite often remarkable, and it's quite impressive to see that firsthand. It also raises opportunities to work locally. The Erasmus programme doesn't just have a mobility aspect, it's also cooperation projects. And for a modest-sized community-based college in Lancaster and Morecambe, it enables us to work in partnership with universities, national associations, as well as international associations. And that actually clears the path somewhat for students to get a clear line of sight to employment prospects and career aspirations as well. It's really quite impressive to see. It also, obviously at the moment there's the threat of it going, which is why I guess we're met. I think that challenge needs to be...
Sorry, which challenge is that?
The challenge of coming out with the Erasmus Plus programme.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes, I think this is why we're here today, to represent the college sector to ensure it continues. Because seeing that and witnessing the change in young people firsthand is quite impressive. And I've seen people really transform their lives directly as a result of Erasmus Plus.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Ms Armistead.
So I should probably give a bit of context. At the University of Nottingham, we're known as having one of the largest student mobility programmes within Erasmus Plus at the university level. So it's probably the type of Erasmus mobility that you may be more familiar with, or that's perhaps quoted more often than some of the other projects, although they are all part of the wider Erasmus Plus programme. And we support around 400 students a year undertaking Erasmus Plus placements, and that accounts for around a quarter of the outward mobility that we have our students participate in. And so for me, it's a really fundamental part of the offering that we have at Nottingham. We want to be an outward-looking, international university. We know that many of our students choose to come to Nottingham for that very reason. They're looking for those opportunities. And to sort of echo some of the comments already made, for our students, they're ever looking for new opportunities that allow them to be global in many ways. And certainly, even though changes are obviously in place for the UK's relationship as part of the EU, our students are sort of looking to be as European as possible, and they see student mobility and as opportunities to go and study or work in Europe as being vital in many cases. You also commented about these sort of upward mobility and as elements. I mean, Erasmus does support students with extra levels of grant if they come from what's in the university area, the widening participation groups of students, those from disadvantaged groups or underrepresented groups. At the moment, that only tends to support study placements, but obviously it would be interesting to see that support other types of students in future. And there is also extra support for students, for example, who have disabilities. We've had a number of students go with quite complicated disabilities that need extra support, and we've been able to get extra money for those students from Erasmus Plus to support them, which is something that we don't have in other schemes as well. So just to touch upon that point.
That's a very helpful start. Thank you very much for that. I ought to say that we'll aim to finish about 11:45, and we've got quite a lot to get through. So I just mention that now. Lady Massey.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that confirmation of how exciting, useful Erasmus Plus is, and I think we all appreciate that very much. A couple of questions on the possible uncertainties in relation to Brexit. Have the government's underwrite guarantee and November Draft Withdrawal Agreement helped to provide reassurance in this regard? And I'll just run these two questions together. And so what is your understanding also of how the underwrite guarantee would work in practice?
Who would like to go first on that?
Okay.
Yes.
So I was also part of the Universities UK working group that met over the summer, and we did talk about the underwrite at that point quite a lot, and in subsequent months we've discussed it ever more. I think we feel there is some reassurance from government, but we would like to ask for more, in the sense of we had initially expected there to be a transition period and could see how that underwrite might come into play if that were the case. Obviously, situations move on, and we're now looking at what may be a no-deal scenario. And in that case, there are questions already being asked about students who are currently overseas and who on March 30th might not be part of the Erasmus programme, if that's the way the Brexit situation unfolds. I've also asked the question of how long the underwrite actually continues for, and colleagues at Universities UK have tried to reassure me that it will continue for both the 2019-20 academic year and potentially also 2020-21 academic year. But I have my doubts about that. Reading the technical notice, I can't necessarily see how it goes beyond the 2019-2020 academic year. Forgive me for the numbers. But and why that's key for me is we have students who started on courses this September who are planning to be in Europe in 2020, 2021. And at the moment, you're absolutely right that the key word is uncertainty. Now, we are trying to reassure students. We are trying to make sure that we continue to support them and to deliver the exchanges and experience they're anticipating. But greater clarity on how the underwrite would work, the practicalities of that in many cases as well, would be hugely beneficial, because I think we will only have ever more questions and queries on this, particularly after the Christmas break, I think, if things haven't developed.
Yeah,
Mr. Latham.
Yeah, I echo that completely. And on a more sort of practitioner level, someone who applies for project funding, our partners abroad are also worth mentioning in this situation, because sometimes we're dealing with money. Money is a very emotive topic in further education across the country, just as it is in our modest-sized community-based college. Partners hedge their bets when it comes to partnering on projects, whether it's sending and hosting students, whether it's doing small, medium or large-scale cooperations under the Erasmus Plus Key Action 2 strand. They, at the moment, are asking questions, and they perhaps are looking elsewhere, regardless of the technical notes, which do differ slightly. The European Union have published something which is slightly different. Although the guarantee is in place, it's quite clear, it's in black and white, it doesn't stop somebody erring on the side of caution when a substantial amount of money is at play. And I think, in my experience, we are invited onto fewer projects this year. That's practical practitioner impact that's happening now.
And you would put that down clearly to Brexit and the uncertainty that's created, would you?
It could be personal, I don't know, but I'd rather think it's. I
wasn't suggesting
uncertainty of Brexit. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just echo those points really. I mean, there are sort of two elements to this. The practical side of things, where, as has been rightly pointed out, the underwrite doesn't extend far enough for students who are starting university this academic year, and for those students who are currently applying for university for the next academic year as well. So that there's some really specific points and technical, practical points around that which need to be addressed, which aren't covered there. The broader picture, as we've heard, though, is that this sort of message that has been sent, that if the idea behind this underwrite was to reassure applicants and to reassure students, I don't think that's being done either. I mean, we saw quite a substantial, even though this year we've seen a slight incline in applications for EU student applications through UGAS, that hasn't recovered since the vote in 2016. So there's clearly some concern broadly around mobility and students wanting to study here. And I think until there is the other thing to say is that it's one thing to say that we will underwrite it. It's another thing to actually talk about whether the conditions, the immigration regime, will actually permit those sorts of things to take place. Whether or not we haven't seen the immigration white paper published yet, we don't know whether practically those students will be able to study and in what way it will be different to what it is at the moment. So I think there's some real concerns around that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bill Kirkhead.
Good morning. I was for many years a member of the European Parliament till fairly recently, and I'm sure that the original Erasmus programme and the Erasmus Plus programmes have been enormously beneficial. In fact, the reports both here and on the other side of the channel, as it were. And I wonder if I could ask you to turn your thoughts slightly across the channel and your connections and your work with European friends. I want to ask you this, really. We have various scenarios as to what might occur here in terms of negotiations, but let us assume just for the moment that whether we have a no-deal scenario or whether we have a scenario which does not sufficiently cover a programme like Erasmus+. Are you concerned or have you views about whether you think that from a European perspective, and I'm thinking specifically of the Commission here, but also obviously those who are implementing the programme there, do you think there is a problem here about us not being allowed, regardless of whatever the government here decides in underwriting terms, allow us to continue to take part in specific projects and placements which exist under the scheme? And if that is the case, if that were to be the case, have you any thoughts as to how we could all be alternatively involved in a way that would be helpful in the same way as Erasmus Plus provides for the students now?
So if I may just come in on that, but I mean, obviously our position is quite clear that a no-deal scenario would be absolutely catastrophic. And I think part of, in terms of specifically in relation to this question, you can't really isolate it from the broader political landscape and the way in which that no deal comes about. If it is the case that no deal has come about because negotiations have completely failed and there have been threats on whichever side and there's so much bad blood, I think the idea that this would be top of the agenda for things to be sorted out is completely ridiculous. I mean, we met with the European Commission earlier this year in Brussels, the Education Division, and at that point they said BrExit had they said that education and Erasmus hadn't yet been discussed or finalised yet as part of the negotiations because they were still trying to iron out all the other issues. So it may actually be there might be some will and pressure from clearly from universities wanting to keep this going. But if at the higher level the politics has broken down, it makes it harder to see how those programmes could continue in the way that they've continued at the moment. And I refer back to what I said in my previous response, is that if overnight the immigration status of students and practitioners and academics change suddenly, which everyone expects under a no-deal scenario they will, and not actually to anything that we know, to a completely uncertain situation, it's unclear to me how the fallout from that can be resolved quickly enough to allow a sort of seamless transition and continuation of many of these programmes. So that's really our concern, and the point was raised about the students who are currently studying who will be on their year abroad, potentially when we hit March the 29th. I mean, we may see a situation where embassies and high commissions are getting involved in trying to get people back home and vice versa. So there's some real concerns here if there isn't a very clear landscape and clear understanding of what people's status will be after if we get to a no-deal Brexit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Again, I echo the same concerns for the vocational education and training sector across the country. I believe that the UK is the most popular destination for vocational students across Europe entering into the UK.
Are there any figures on that, do you know? Perhaps you could send them to us afterwards if you've got some. I think that would be very helpful.
I can certainly arrange them to be sent afterwards. Yeah,
thank you.
Sure. And the uncertainty around the immigration status for volunteers as well as students, it's the same concerns apply. And there's no doubt that there's desire for a vocational college like ours to continue, and probably the same across the country. A lot of this will boil down to funding. The fact that Erasmus Plus, I don't know if it's been mentioned yet, it gives full subsidy to young people to go abroad. It's fully subsidised. It means that anybody can take part. With all the will in the world, it needs to be backed up with money as well. So regardless of the no deal and under the scenarios, that has to be the case, come what may, for it to continue.
Thank you.
I'd like to say briefly that I would urge those that have the opportunity within government to continue to talk to the European Commission about us obviously remaining through the transition period. The Erasmus programme does go on to the end of 2020, as with many European programmes. So I would urge anybody who has that opportunity to speak to the Commission and to look at a way in which we can at least associate that end of the programme and then debate what comes in the next programme. Certainly, I spend a lot of my time at the moment talking to colleagues from across Europe in various ways, and they are also trying to figure out what this all means. For example, in Germany, I've had colleagues trying to contact the DAD and working out where that all fits together, and they are also very concerned. However, they're also determined to continue to work with us, and I think it's a very positive message I'm getting from universities in Europe at the moment, which is they as a collective do not want to lose these connections and collaborations as well. So we have an opportunity within that wider collective, I think, to be able to come together. Sorry.
But regardless of the will that appears to be there, are you getting the feeling, I mean, my question really was meant to probe the question of your relationships in Europe particularly, are you getting the feeling that whatever the political outcomes might be, there is a strong wish to try and maintain something equivalent, if not exactly the same as Erasmus Plus, in the exchange arrangements with those countries?
For my colleagues in similar positions to me in Europe, they wish the UK to remain in Erasmus Plus in all of its forms, because they see as valuable and vital to so many of their connections across Europe. So I hope that gives you a very succinct view from me.
Thank you. That leads rather on to Lord Best's question.
My question goes a bit further to the actual member states, and at a higher level what people are feeling in Europe, the other 27, about us. We've heard earlier that the UK tends to punch above its weight and is influential and important in the Erasmus, but equally that we get more out of it, more of our students benefit than those from other countries. And I think that the question is, at the higher level than the academic community, the people directly participating in the programme, is there support or resentment, hostility even, to the UK's participation, or is there, do we feel, Gail, this is probably one for you,
sure,
at that member country level, is there support for a continuation into the next phase of Erasmus for us?
In every conversation I have had, both institutional level, where the Russell Group of Universities UK have been talking to relevant national agencies or similar bodies in those countries, it is overwhelmingly supportive of us remaining in Erasmus+, both within the next 2 years and into the successor programme. They very much want us to be involved. We're key for them to be involved in it, yes.
So I was at the Paris Ministerial, the European Higher Education Area conference earlier this year, and spoke to a couple of ministers and also student union counterparts as well. And the message from them was very clear that they want us to remain. The question, though, is how quickly would that mood shift if the immigration status becomes so different to what it is at the moment? And if you think about the hoops and the hurdles that students from outside the EU have to go through in order to prove that they're not going to drop out and they can't work too much, and they have to get out after a certain number of months. There's huge restrictions around that which currently don't apply to EU students, which will be completely alien to EU students. The idea of having to get a guarantor, having a certain amount of money in your bank account before you arrive. The reason why those restrictions are so tough on students from outside the EU is because citizens from outside the EU have to also demonstrate those sorts of things when they come here as well. They're not treated the same as EU nationals. And I think the minute if we suddenly transition towards a much tougher immigration regime where there's much more attendance monitoring for those students, I think we would start to lose some of that capital that we have at the moment in these conversations. That's a huge risk.
And do you think is that a risk which would arise only, in your view, if we were to leave without a deal and no transition period, or is it a risk that would happen in any event?
So obviously there are lots of different scenarios being sort of played out. Even with the Prime Minister's deal, because one of the key tenets is ending freedom of movement, the only conclusion you can draw from that is that for EU nationals there will be more stringent immigration controls. And it's unclear to me at this point in time what that would mean for students who want to study here for longer than a couple of weeks. What sort of things would they have to put in place to ensure that, from the Home Office's point of view, young people aren't using the Erasmus scheme as a way to come in, drop out, and to stay in the country? And that's the sort of language that will be talked about. And in that context, it is likely that there will be more barriers than there are at the moment, or at least more hurdles than there are at this moment in time, in order to ensure that the system is, quote unquote, not abused in that sense. And I would be deeply uncomfortable with any change to the system in that sense.
May I add one very quick point about immigration? And this is not something necessarily this can be dealt with in the UK, but more and more at the university level, when we're seeing students go to Europe on Erasmus student mobility, they are actually undertaking work placements. Now, I appreciate there will be immigration changes, and status of students is something that we're very concerned about if they wish to undertake employment as opposed to a university-based study placement. In a university like Nottingham, we may see changes, we may see students take up more opportunities within universities rather than working if immigration status does change. But that's a real concern across the sector and in many of the Russell Group universities, because there are colleagues who work in universities which, for their Erasmus students, maybe the majority are actually undertaking work placements. And those students are the very students who, on graduation, are undertaking jobs related to Europe in business, in law, in economics, or going then to work in Europe in similar ways. And that is something that obviously we can't resolve. But again, coming back to the point about working with those national agencies or government level, the transition period would at least give us a period of time to be able to plan and to look at those differences. But it could have quite a big effect on the opportunities that actually students have. So it's just something on the flip side. Immigration on both sides, for me, certainly has concerns.
Thank you. Lord Hazelhurst.
Well, we know the draft regulation for the 2021-27 Erasmus programme allows for third countries to become associated on similar terms to any EU member, or there is the alternative of participating on a more limited basis in agreed projects and activities. Have you done any work on the likely costs and benefits of these options, and is there one that you would prefer if it comes to that?
I have to say, I struggle a little bit with this question only because to try and consider some of the costs is actually quite difficult. A lot of the costs that are related to Erasmus are not necessarily publicly available, and I'm not necessarily privy to what it would mean in that sense. But I think we've certainly taken the view that looking at the next phase in the successor programme of the Erasmus Plus programme, we're very keen for the UK to continue to consider association of that programme. Obviously, there is some discussion about extending the programme, increasing the amount of mobility that might take place, and that appears to have potentially a higher cost to it, which I am aware the government would want to negotiate on. But I would want them there at the table trying to help formulate what that new programme looks like so that it best reflects the type of mobility that the UK wishes to participate in. We're keen to encourage more funding, for example, to go towards WUP students, those from wider participation backgrounds. We're keen for more projects that have short-term mobility attached to them, because we know that students who are currently underrepresented in mobility will take part in those shorter programmes. So we're keen to be at that table now and helping to formulate that programme. And to therefore hopefully make that successor programme as relevant as possible to what our students are currently looking for.
The association...
I was going to say, is time running out, therefore, to pursue either option? With any certainty?
It certainly feels like it. From where I sit, yes. I mean, I suppose we had worked till the summer with the expectation of a transition period, and over the last few months, obviously, as situations have changed, we've had to rethink. It certainly for me, it feels for me, and I'm sure for colleagues, when you're working with students who potentially are already out or wanting to take part in these projects, you're trying to recruit them, you're trying to enthuse them, it does feel like time is now very short. And I say I want the UK to be at that table and helping to mould what it looks like, because I think we have a lot to offer as a country, and our students have a huge amount to offer throughout Europe.
Yeah, and I echo the same sentiments as well from the college and associations of colleges' point of view and the members. We would prefer, if not similar, full access to the current arrangements, and including a seat at the table, if you will. Limiting access will affect the quality of the cooperation and collaboration that already exists, and development of further and new cooperation. At the moment, Erasmus Plus remains open on a college level to anybody who wants to take part, regardless of their financial status, and it needs to be guaranteed as well. I think it needs to be on equal footing with HE as well. That's the FE sector, and it might even be the case that post-Brexit we need to invest more to ensure that we're not estranged from our European colleagues and friends. I'm sure that will come up in some later discussions. There's no doubt that at the moment the young people that we deal with need to have a lot of preparation, even for a short-term mobility. We need to know as far ahead in advance that we can sell it to them, introduce the idea. For some people, it's a life-changing opportunity. It may only sound 2 or 3 weeks abroad, but it's, again, back to that message, it's a big step in their career. And it's a big step in their future, whether it's work-based or in higher education. So I think we need to aim for full access, as it is now. It should be the benchmark we aim for.
And I'd have to agree with that. I think that any change to the current arrangements will only result in, I would imagine, further costs and less say. And I'll give a sort of an example that we've been dealing with on the student representation front. So I'm one of the lead delegates to the European Students' Union, which isn't affiliated at all to the EU and has members, has students represented from outside EU countries. But one of the really interesting conversations is around how the education, and that sort of tertiary education in the broadest sense, there are a lot of schemes alongside Erasmus which are trying to integrate and to sort of really bolster the status of education in Europe. And one of the conversations is being had around a European student card. Now, we have quite serious concerns about the impact the European Student Card might have on our students' unions and discounts and all the rest of it, and whether or not it will be integrated enough, and we think it should be delayed and rolled out. And we have a seat at the European Students' Union table to make the case for that on behalf of the UK. But actually, if we can't also convince our governments here, or the governments here don't also have the same level of same seat at the table to put forward the case for the other things that might be happening, we might end up with a situation where we are partaking in something like the Erasmus Plus, but there are other integrated parts which we can't take part in, and we don't have a say in the design of the whole education, higher education joined up landscape that is sort of being proposed. So our view has always been that we want to be as involved in Erasmus Plus, but also the other initiatives which are happening around education as possible, so that we can shape them, because we do have, give or take 4, 5, 6, 7 million students in the UK who potentially could access some of these programs, and we want to make sure that their voice is being represented in whatever future European education arrangements there are.
Lord BrExit.
Thank you. I think my question rather follows on, actually, on this issue of assuming that we do go for full association, how we make it work. Because if we are in the scenario of having a deal and having a transition period, then at least the government has a little bit of opportunity to negotiate the future. And an association agreement would give us some opportunity, one hopes, to influence, but we would be a rule taker rather than a rule maker. We wouldn't be sitting at the table making the decisions. I think that's clear from the EU side. So if that's true, I think the answer follows, but from your experience of how the Erasmus programme works at Brussels level, how much access and influence in shaping things do you think we really could expect to have? And what would be the best way of going about that? Will that just be done through government, or can universities, can students' unions, can other bodies in the Erasmus family help to make sure we keep that influence on the assumption that we are going for an association?
There are ways. So, certainly at the university level, I think it's limited as an individual university, although you'll have associations like LERU, ECAU, there are various networks that universities are participants in, and who are often invited to the Commission to actually discuss new proposals. And at that point, there is a way to have a voice which is actually collective across Europe, not necessarily purely the UK. But I think without us having that opportunity to shape the programme, we may miss out on the chance to voice some of the concerns that we have in the UK higher education and in further education that may be particular to our students. I appreciate that it is a programme that covers a wide range of countries, and certainly each time a new programme starts there is a new element to the programme which hasn't been seen before. Some are useful from a UK perspective, others are not, but that is part of being the collective. And I think when I look at it and I look at where it fits in the wider portfolio that I work with, it's one of those foundations. We've learned a lot from working across Europe through Erasmus+, whether that's learning how to do sort of some of this administration at a very high level, how to make things most cost effective by working in certain ways with partners. I would certainly say if I compare creating a new Erasmus agreement with a university in Europe compared to, say, an agreement in, say, Australia or the US, it's a much quicker and easier path to follow. We understand each other's sort of bureaucracy and elements because we're all working under this charter. Otherwise, it's a far more time-consuming process, far more resource-heavy endeavour. So there are huge benefits for me which allow us to work collectively across Europe. And personally, I would like to see us develop more of that because I only see more opportunities for our students. But yes, there will always be a negotiation element to it. I like the idea of working through a transition and then the successor programme. I think it's much easier to consider. I think if not, at best, we may be an associate programme and merely have to accept what is given as opposed to actually be able to mould it anyway.
I think association, without making any of the rules or policies, would be better than nothing. But I don't think it would be ideal.
Right.
I don't know how much influence we could have. But there are other countries that aren't in the EU which also have a say in shaping Erasmus Plus, from what I believe. Whether it's Norway, Turkey, a big player in Erasmus Plus, Iceland, etc. They are still valued partners in Erasmus Plus, and they bring something different. Each of them brings something different on a different scale, and there are other countries that are allowed to participate in certain strands of the program, and they're all valued. I still think that to get the local and the unique problems that the UK faces, to be able to participate in Erasmus Plus and fund some of those projects addressing those concerns is crucial. So, not to have a say, to be able to get those concerns, projects to tackle those concerns would be a real travesty. So, but yeah, I think that's...
And just really quickly, I mean, I sort of addressed some of what your question in the previous points about European Student Card and certain concerns we have and the way in which we might want to influence that. All I would say is that I think the sorts of conversations that will, that have in the past and that would give us the sort of influence that we would need to change things and to have a say, are quite often quite informal. They're not always about formal settings. They're about relationships. And I think there's a broader political question: is that if we have a traumatic exit from the European Union, that will permeate throughout all sorts of parts of negotiation teams on both sides, and it will be things like this that will become much harder to have a say on if the broader divorce, if you will, is not very pleasant.
Right. And so the informal upstream shaping of how the programmes are going to be going is something we could hope have an ambition to maintain, even if we're not actually at the meeting of the council that takes the decision on it. And that sounds to me quite important. Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Soley.
I want to dig down a little into these three possibilities, either full association, the limited partnership, or no participation at all, and the amount of preparation and effort you have to put into those three. Let's start with what I think is the easiest one, the full association one. You obviously would prefer that. How much participation, how much time do you need to prepare that? Presumably it's mainly administrative type things you'd need to change on that. Do you need a lot of notice from the government that that's what their preferred option is, or could you do that at fairly short notice?
So, sorry, you're right, I'll take one. So full association to me also presumes we continue during the transition period in its current programme. Is that acceptable for the question? I think on that basis, having gone through, I think, 3 Erasmus programmes now, yes, there is added administrative work to do when programmes move into their successor programme. And certainly at that time it increases the work, but it is doable. We can plan for it, and in fact, regardless of what happens, we already have planning for next year when we will start to talk about renewing agreements and the successor programme, what that means. So that work, I would say, is administratively, it's already in place, and we've planned for it, we've got the resource for it. So that feels like it's doable and preferable, even though we know that there will be an added burden, as there is each time a successor programme is created.
Yeah. Would you both agree with that, or?
Time is of the essence, really. And I mean, some of the preparation of some projects in Erasmus Plus, they've been running for a decade or more. I have personal experience of that and other member colleges of the AOC. And when time is of the essence, I think you may lead to cutting corners, and that's one thing you can't do when you're talking about young people going abroad. It's really crucial to get everything right. I wouldn't say it's unacceptable to take over a year to plan an exchange for students. It's anything less than that, you're risking, you're putting something at risk. And the quality assurance aspect of the projects will be affected. So and again, it's not quality assurance in the everyday sense; it's quality of people's lives. So and the young people have to be nurtured and really looked after when sent on exchanges or they go on project exchanges abroad. So I think that's time is of the essence really there. But a year or more is quite
okay. Let me look at the second one, the limited partnership. And I guess that's very complex because you don't know what form the limited partnership would be. So again, the government has to tell you at some stage which of the three options they're going to go for. Presumably, you want as much notice as possible and also what type of limited partnership it would be. Can you give us any more guidance on what your views are on that, other than that you'd rather not be in that position?
I mean, we've certainly discussed this at quite a length with University UK, and it was part of our Erasmus paper that we presented in the summer. I think we gave as a guidance that we would like to know by October, November 2018 what was going to be happening. So, I mean, we've already missed one of our hoped aspirational milestones. I think there was another one in there for early 2019 as well, so I suppose we could shift a bit and work towards that. So the answer for me is really as soon as possible. As we've said in many of our answers, we're dealing here with real people. We have students currently abroad, we have students preparing to go abroad, we have projects we want to apply for funding. And when I look at it in the work that we do, I'm looking at student support matters, I'm looking at the realities of it. So for me, it feels that really, as soon as possible, it is what we ask for. We appreciate there is much going on, and we know that Erasmus isn't always at the top of the agenda when it comes to the question of leaving the EU, but in any way that can be encouraged, we would ask for that assistance.
Well, people are discovering it's a complex issue, but have either of the other two witnesses got anything to add to that?
I mean, ideally we would have known this 2 years ago, but in terms of where we are now, I can't see a situation where even with full association there won't be some disruption, even if it's at the level of messaging. I mean, what are we telling people that this scheme looks like? If it's not going to be the same, how different is it going to be post 2020? And I think I'd be very, very, very surprised if we got back to the same levels of participation that we saw before 2016 in the next couple of years. I think we have to expect some kind of disruption because things will change.
But your key answer to the limited participation one is A, you want to know as soon as possible, and B, you want to know what sort of limited. Right. Let's turn to the third one. The government decides, or it is decided because we just come out of Europe in short notice and not thinking everything through. And there is therefore no participation. Does that mean you have to wind everything up?
For me, absolutely not. In that we, from the day after the referendum, we were very clear at Nottingham, and I think many universities are saying, which is we are absolutely open for business with our European counterparts and our colleagues, and we will endeavour to retain as many of the student mobility opportunities as we have. That will be difficult. As we have already said, even just the next 6 months could be very difficult, even not thinking more broadly. But at every turn when we have spoken to European colleagues about continuing the student mobility and the relationships we have, it has been overwhelmingly positive that we all wish to continue to work together. Now, as has been said, that could be, obviously they were affected by disruption, and we're not sort of, ignoring that fact. But no, I would hope that at least within the education sector, we will continue to be as European focused and collaborative as we have always been. Although it may be in a different form, it may be in different partnerships, and that's going to be what we're going to learn about.
Well, that follows on from it, because it seems to me the key issue would be funding. Do the funds come from the EU? Do they come from the UK government? Or do you get them by charging or whatever? Is that part of your considerations or what?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that's definitely part of it. My broader concern actually is around the facilitation of travel and the immigration status, because even if we leave with a deal and a transition period, if EU students are treated the same way as international students are treated, so non-home EU students, then there will be significant changes. So we've been pushing quite strongly that there should be some sort of special status for EU students if this goes ahead, because that's the only way to minimise the disruption. In terms of answering the sort of question that you put down, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that in the event that they say that we're not participating in it, they're not also going to then turn around and say, and yes, it's fine, we'll make it easier for you to have some kind of mobility scheme as long as you do it on your own, because that's not going to be on the top of their agenda. And leaving schemes like this would probably come alongside just sort of cutting ties sort of completely with Europe. So they're not going to make it easier for us to do this work. So my concern would be that whilst there may be a lot of goodwill and intention, and the funding may appear from somewhere, it may be raised on both sides of the channel, if you will, there'll be some technical things that will make it almost impossible for it to continue in the same way that it continues today.
Can I just pick up on the funding? I do have a concern for the outward mobility for the funding, though, in the sense that I think if the Erasmus funding were lost, we would still have students wanting to go to Europe, but how we want to grow the number of students, the percentage of students participating who come from less well-represented backgrounds. And I think that would become a much harder task. And that worries me greatly, because all the work we're doing at the moment within the university is to try and increase accessibility, is to make sure there is greater diversity in that student group. And I don't see, without the Erasmus funding, I actually see that potentially contracting, which is the exact opposite of everything else we're trying to do internationally. So from a funding perspective, that does worry me greatly.
Please.
Just add one thing to that. From the college's point of view again, sadly, but I think the mobility opportunities would stop in their tracks. They wouldn't continue after, in our own modest-sized community-based college, it would possibly revert back to those who can afford to go will go. And it's not something we want to see, because at the moment it fully subsidises placements for, as I said before, from any background. It will be a funding cut in all intents and purposes, and it will probably not continue. And last year, in 2016, there were almost 10,000 vocational learners and staff went on mobilities abroad. It would stop. So sadly, but that's the position for vocational colleges across the country.
But somebody, sorry, I will come back now briefly if I may. Somebody different views about the future of Britain post-Brexit would say, well, surely you can make arrangements with other countries around the world, the United States, Australia, Canada, whatever. Why couldn't you set up something special?
But in vocational area, you're possibly talking short-term mobility placements for students who have possibly special needs, difficult circumstances at home. Europe is their destination. It's a short trip, it's a short-term mobility. A mobility experience in Canada or Australia, whilst it sounds really a great opportunity, I would welcome it on top of Erasmus Plus. It's possibly too risky to start looking at those opportunities when our real partners are on our doorstep.
Could I just ask Ms. Armstead a question? I wasn't quite certain when you talked about we earlier on, whether you were talking about Nottingham University or whether you were talking about the Russell Group. And really the question is, do you think the impact would vary from university to university?
I think it would, in the sense that we obviously are all running slightly different student mobility programmes. So at Nottingham, we have a group of students who are going on both study and work. So we know that more students might end up doing study placements in future, whereas I know other colleagues in other Russell Group universities have far more work placements involved, so they're already seeing a shift. So I think it does depend across the sector as to how you engage with Erasmus, but I think the principles remain the same regardless, because you want to continue and only increase the amount of activity. And I think that would be the same at the FE level as well. We're all looking to have greater international opportunities for our students rather than fewer, and none of this feels like it would increase it if we aren't part of this programme.
Thank you. Lady Pinnock.
Yes, you've answered part of the question I have, which is about the non-participation impact. But if you were able to draw up like a manifesto for the future of Erasmus Plus in a whatever situation that we are going to be in, what would be on your tick list on this manifesto? Number one.
Sorry, you blanked us because I'm now thinking, how long do we have? I mean, I suppose for me, what I would like to see in the successor programme, when I've read the information, is much greater emphasis on encouraging all students to be able to access the programmes.
Yeah.
I would like to see much more shorter term mobility included in it, because we are seeing more and more demand for that from the student population in the UK, and particularly at Nottingham, and that is something we've only been doing the last sort of 5 years or so, but we're already seeing that. And I'd like to see that real focus. I mean, we've talked about, it can sound simplistic, but it is a life-changing experience for so many of our students. And I look at those students when they are coming up to graduation. Many of them reflect then upon the experience they've had, and they have so much to offer employers and potentially in the future. And you look at that and you feel like that's why we're all sort of fighting to stay in it, because we want to continue to have opportunities for students and just to broaden them out. But for me, it's definitely access, diversity, and flexibility, different options within the successor programme if we could. We may not get all of that, but I'd like to think it
put it on your tick list.
Yeah, they're definitely on my tick list, yes.
Right.
Well, I mean, again, quite a challenging question, and I suppose the sort of cop-out answer is to say that
don't do that.
there's a pretty good blueprint for it, and it's what we've got already, which is a sort of broader metaphor for what Parliament or the public will be thinking about Brexit in general. But I think the points that were raised were really important, because where we were was at a stage of trying to expand the programme. I think there needs to be a real focus on the widening access, but also the way in which the programmes and schemes are communicated to students needs to improve as well, and the support given to students whilst they're there also needs to, I think, improve. And one of the things that we've been talking about internally is around the access to support services and financial support if students get into difficulties whilst they're studying abroad. I think being able then, once they return to, which happens at the moment, to really showcase to employers, to people going to further study, the real benefits of what they've been studying is absolutely key. But it needs to be, the core is that the barriers for accessing the programme, the barriers for then doing actual mobility need to be as seamless as possible. If there is any success programme, obviously, as it's probably quite clear from my remarks, the current system is sort of our starting point.
Yeah. But you haven't mentioned immigration status.
And so when I said that the transition in the actual mobility scheme needs to be as seamless as possible, that includes immigration status. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Like to add on?
I concur to what's just been said, but also, obviously, it needs to. Obviously, there's an obvious answer here to retain our participation in Erasmus Plus as it is, but whilst it's welcome that we might be able to pick and choose some aspects of it, it's all about barriers at the vocational level as well. We need to break down those barriers. This flexibility is a word that comes up quite a lot as well, to be more flexible, how we support young people from challenging backgrounds, people who have jobs. They have to have a job to study on a further education course. They have to live. To support those people and have a flexibility when it comes to the options of mobility abroad. I'll take with what we've got now, but I think it can always be improved.
So funding.
Funding and flexibility.
Funding and flexibility, right.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We're extremely grateful to you all for coming, and thank you very much in particular. I know Mr. Layton's come rather a long way at rather short notice, but we're particularly grateful for that. That's been extremely helpful to us, and we're very grateful to all three of you for coming in and talking to us this morning. So thank you very much. And we'll just... is that Professor Thompson at the back? No? He's outside. Okay, right.
The proceeding is currently suspended.